So I want to say hello to everyone out there in the audience. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an associate editor for Horde's Dairyman magazine. We'd like to welcome you to our monthly webinar series, which is co-hosted by Horde's Dairyman and the University of Illinois. Today's webinar is titled Nutritional Regulation of Gut Function in Calves, Colostrum and Milk. Our presenter is Michael Steele from the University of Guelph, and we're very pleased to have him online with us. I think we could all agree that feeding high-quality colostrum is one of the most critical factors in calf survival and health. Dr. Steele will talk about colostrum feeding, transitioning calves to a higher plane of nutrition, and much more. This month's webinar is sponsored by Cargill, and we want to thank them for their support of this program. Our webinar team consists of Jim Baltz at the University of Illinois and our Horde's Dairyman online media manager, Patty Hurchin, and they're the ones that really work behind the scenes to make sure everything works for our presentations each month. My co-host is the wonderful Mike Hutchins, who is a professor emeritus from the University of Illinois. Mike, I'll let you take over from here to give a little more introduction of our speaker and get this month's webinar rolling.
Well, very good, Abby. It is my personal and professional privilege to introduce Dr. Mike Steele, Associate Professor at the University of Guelph and also Chair of the NSERC Industrial Research Group, and that's similar to the USDA over there at Guelph. He is past president of the Canadian Society of Animal Sciences. He completed his PhD degree at the University of Guelph and then worked for 2 years with NICRO of Canada Ag Research Group before returning to Alberta and then to Guelph, where he's currently working as far as that goes. He received numerous awards from ADSA and from Canadian research groups here. And as Abby indicated, he has done a lot of research in the area of calf health and performance and has published over 70 manuscripts. So, Mike, we are very pleased to have you online today, and we'll turn the program over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity to present at the Horde seminar. This is a true honor of mine, and I'm really excited to discuss some of the new research that our group has been doing in the field of colostrum and milk nutrition for calves. I'd like to first start by how I became interested in early life nutrition is basically growing my family with my wife and just seeing how there's such a massive contrast between the way that we manage or raise our own calves on farm and what happens in infant research in the sciences of infants. And basically, I started reading a lot in this area of early life programming and this idea that life events in the beginning stages of life can have a long-term impact. And we're calling this early life programming. So I like to think of every single calf as a ball rolling down a hill, and how we manage that calf can really determine its future direction. So I think we need to pay very close attention. And I think that there's a lot that we can do here to improve the area of calf nutrition and management. So I became also very interested in these relationships. And the first that was really published in this area was really from Dr. Mike Van Amberg's research at Cornell University, just showing the relationship between accelerating growth in early life during this pre-weaning period and equating that to possibly more milk production later on. So I think that this is an interesting concept. I know that there's papers out there saying that there's no differences between average daily gain and milk production, but I don't think there's been one study published showing any negative impact of accelerating growth or health in early life. So I think that we need to pay very close attention to this and actually weigh calves on farm. So I also have an issue with the way that we've been raising animals with respect to gut health in dairy calves. I think that we have a lot more that we can do here. Although when you look at the mortality rates as well as morbidity, they have been decreasing in recent years, but still with a 5% mortality, 38% morbidity for this calf, I still think that there's a lot to do, in particular in the area I'm interested in, which is improving gut health, since we have 56% of calves during the pre-weaning period with digestive disorders. Also, the immune status of animals, we still have 12.1% of calves that fail passive transfer, so more work that needs to be done with respect to colostrum management. And finally, I think that we're overusing a lot of antibiotics in our field, but I think that we're overusing antibiotics during this time, especially in the first weeks of life. So far too often what I see on farms is images like the next particular slide, where I just think that although we're trying our best to, make sure that this calf is healthy during this time, This is an image taken on a farm in Ontario during daily treatments of antibiotics in a calf nursery. I think that this is what we need to avoid. Firstly, from an animal welfare standpoint, also from a treatment standpoint, I don't think reaching for antibiotics first is the best way. And obviously for consumer acceptance of what we do in the calf industry, I think we need to spend more time on this. So my research program goes through colostrum, which I've been working on extensively for the last 4 years, and probably the next 5 to 10 years we'll have a lot more research in this area. I've also done some analysis in the field of plaintive nutrition, so how much milk we should be feeding a calf, and also how much solid feed after weaning we should be feeding a calf. I always look at alternatives for antimicrobials, and also determining what these antimicrobials are actually doing to the calf as well. And then I've been studying how the dam affects the calf too. So exposure to the dam as well as the prepartum diets. But what I'll be focusing on today is just some of the research that we've been doing in that top part, being the colostrum as well as plaintive nutrition. This idea of colostrum intake in the first day of life is really critical. And I think one of the first studies was published back in 2005, just showcasing that it can have a long-term impact. So in this study, they were comparing calves that were fed 2 liters of colostrum versus 4 liters of colostrum. The biological replication was a little bit smaller than what you would expect to be suitable for an experiment like this. However, they did show differences in average daily gain during the calf period of raising, as well as age of conception was numerically lower in these calves that received more colostrum. The survival through second lactation as well as milk yield through second lactation was also higher, just by feeding more colostrum in that first meal. That was the only difference in this experiment. So I think this is one of the first experiments that just shows that the way we feed a calf colostrum in the first hours of life can have a long-term impact. This is nothing new. So for example, failure of passive immune transfer of these immunoglobulins from colostrum has been shown to delay age at first calving, decrease milk fat production in first lactation, decrease average daily gain to 180 days, and also impact feed efficiency in a negative way. So there's lots more that we can do in this particular field. The question I always receive is, what kind of colostrum should I be feeding? Should I be feeding fresh colostrum straight from the cow, pasteurized colostrum that's frozen, that we test before, or dried colostrum? There's pros and cons to all of these different methods of feeding colostrum. So for example, from a fresh standpoint, arguably it's tailored for the calf, and you have all the bioactive molecules and all the cells that are within colostrum still alive. So there's probably some benefit to that. But the cons there's a lot of opportunity to contaminate fresh colostrum. And it's really difficult to test quality in a very short period of time before feeding it to that calf, because you should be feeding it in the first hours of life. Pasteurized, you can assess the quality and you can reduce the bacterial load. Those are clear pros. It also probably destroys healthy bacteria and immune development cells. And if not managed properly, it can probably affect the bioactive molecules. With respect to dried colostrum sources that are on the market, they're definitely very convenient, and they have a huge advantage with cleanliness and being very consistent. But there is this question of how much of the bioactive molecules are being compromised through all this processes. I think when you look at all these 3 types of feeding colostrum, they all can work. And I don't think we're really at a level to say what is better than the other at this point. I think we still need to go back to basics in many of these feeding management strategies with colostrum. I want to just mention the only way we're really looking at this on a farm right now with respect to assessing colostrum quality, either through, straight from the cow, pasteurized or dried, is looking at levels of serum total protein in calves. And I think that this is a great start. And you can use a Brix refractometer. You can buy it on Amazon for $25. And I think that this is an excellent investment. But I have a vision that in the future, we're going to be expanding this to look at other bioactives within colostrum. For example, insulin or IGF-1 or oligosaccharides, which I'll discuss later in our presentation, because I think that there's a whole wide variety of these measurements that we can take in the future. And we can be a lot more specific in the future rather than just looking at total protein. But for now, total protein is what we're doing on farm. Still, even with some of the research that happened about 12 years ago on farm, there's still a lot of failure of passive transfers when you take blood from these animals. So there's still a long ways to go. We can see that, yeah, it's great that we look at total protein, but there's so many other bioactives within colostrum. Granted, immunoglobulins is over 100 to 1 when you compare colostrum to a whole milk. But look at lactoferrin, IGF-1, IGF-2, epidermal growth factor, insulin, interleukins, relaxin, prolactin, the immune signals, leptin, immune cells as well. This is an enormous list, and really this list is primarily focused on proteins. We haven't talked about the lipids, which are really high in omega-6, a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids within colostrum. What's that doing to the calf? I don't think we have a clear idea. As well as the carbohydrates, they're very high in oligosaccharides, not lactose. What is that doing? I think we have so much more to uncover with respect to the biological activity of colostrum. So this led to some of the first work that we were doing, just looking at some of the ideal components of colostrum management. And really, when you look at colostrum management, there's 4 different things. It's the quickness, it's also the cleanliness, quantity, as well as the quality. So I think making sure that you feed these calves as soon as possible, it's clean as possible, you're getting enough into them, and you have a high quality colostrum source. This is really the key to making sure that you're successful. The next experiment, I wanted to look at colostrum feeding method. And if we can go through this entire slide, the basic question that I receive from a lot of producers is, should I be tube or bottle feeding my colostrum? And when you bottle feed, and this is an example on the left of a calf that's been fed a colostrum meal with barium sulfate in it, so it immediately lights up within the abomasum. So it bypasses the rumen and goes straight to the abomasum through the use of the esophageal groove. But when you tube feed, it goes straight into the rumen first, and then makes its way into the abomasum through time. My question was, does this affect, not only passive transfer when you're feeding these larger meals of colostrum, but is it impacting gut function in any way, or passage rate to the lower gut, as well as the release of these hormones within the gut that the gut is always producing? So the results of this experiment, where it's been published in the Journal of Dairy Science, and we put catheters in right at birth in this experiment, and then we fed the same colostrum that was pooled. This was a dried colostrum source for this experiment, fed at 3 liters in this first meal. And to my surprise, there was no difference with respect to passive transfer. I thought there would be a delay of gastric emptying from this abomasum to the intestine, but clearly from the immunoglobulin results, there was no difference. They all achieved great passive transfer. And we use acetaminophen in our lab to measure this passage of liquid meals from the abomasum to the intestine. So as soon as it moves to the intestine, you're going to get a spike in blood acetaminophen. And that's a good marker of if this meal is being released and at what rate this meal is being released from the abomasum to the small intestine. And as you can see from these results, looking at blood acetaminophen, again, there is no differences between these 2 treatments. So if you're feeding these larger meals of colostrum, although it's going into the rumen, it's not staying there as long, and it's not going to be depressing overall passage rate. And you're going to achieve really good immunoglobulin levels within blood, similar to what you would find in a bottle. So if time is an issue and labor is an issue, and you're not getting the colostrum in as soon as possible in the first hours of life, I would seriously consider just using tube feeding in your operation for the colostrum meal. So this led us to another round of experiments where we had the question of, yes, I know farmers are trying to feed their colostrum as soon as possible, but realistically, calves are born in the middle of the night between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. And what happens when we delay this colostrum meal, even by a short amount of time, let's say 6 hours, and in some circumstances, even 12 hours on farm? So this is just looking at the blood immunoglobulin levels in this experiment. They were all fed a pasteurized colostrum source in this experiment, just 1 meal followed by a quick transition to a milk replacer. And there was a clear advantage, obviously, to feeding as soon as possible at this 0 hours. But 6 and 12 hours, to our surprise, there was no difference. So what you would read in a textbook is that this gradually declines, but in this particular circumstance, it doesn't between the 6 and 12 hours, which we found really interesting. And really, I'll talk about that later in my presentation. It's really started a huge branch of research with respect to gut closure in our lab. But the real reason why we wanted to look at this experiment is some of the work that's been shared with me by Dr. Bob James, just showing, in this particular transmission electron micrograph of a calf with colostrum deprived calf on the left, you actually see some E. coli entering the enterocytes, and you see this destruction of the microvilli if a calf isn't receiving colostrum in time, compared to what you would see with a really healthy enterocyte. And you see those dark areas on the right, those are actually immunoglobulins within these enterocytes. So just some more qualitative look, just what I'm looking at, but we wanted to really see how does this delay, even 6 hours and 12 hours after birth of feeding colostrum, how does that affect the establishment of the gut microbiota? So this leads us to where we just looked at markers of a healthy gut. And why we want a healthy gut with respect to what bacteria are colonizing the gut is because there's a lot of microbial dysfunction that happens in the calf from the ages of 7 to 28 days of life, where a lot of them get diarrhea. So we think anything we can do to establish a healthy microbial population within the gastrointestinal tract should alleviate some of these problems. And what's shown in this particular study is that the bifidobacteria as well as the lactobacillus are higher in these calves at 0 hours feeding compared to 12. So this is just more ammunition to try to get farmers to pay closer attention to getting this colostrum in the first hours of life. I think some of the biggest issues what I see with respect to colostrum management is that really the contamination of colostrum. And if you look at the percentage of samples that are under 100,000 total bacteria counts, it's still, there's a big proportion that are over 100,000, and there's some over 1 million. And I think just the cleanliness of how we operate, how we clean the feeding equipment is really critical. And because we just don't want to be filling the gastrointestinal tract with harmful bacteria during this time. I think it's so critical. So this has led to, just paying closer attention to not only total plate counts, but also total coliform counts. As soon as you take that colostrum from the udder and you go to the bucket and then to an esophageal feeder tuber, you're opening up many different avenues for different pathogens to enter, or different harmful bacteria to really enter that colostrum and eventually go to the calf. So this led to one of the first questions that we received online over the last week. Is it necessary to pasteurize colostrum? And up to what temperature can we pasteurize colostrum to avoid denaturing of colostrum proteins? So I think, if you can guarantee me that there's no pathogens that are in that colostrum, then I don't see a point in pasteurization. However, I don't know many farms that can actually do that. So I think it's a good tool to investigate with respect to pasteurization to the colostrum. But I think if mismanaged, it can actually backfire on you. Now, I know that, even a deviation of just a couple degrees Fahrenheit or a couple degrees Celsius can actually impact immunoglobulins. And I think it can actually denature some of the proteins. So that's why if it's not being calibrated often on farm, and we're not, double checking the temperatures of pasteurization, this is not probably a tool that you want to invest in your farm. However, if you do that and you feel like you're, a proper management, we're making sure that our temperatures are all very, very accurate, then it is something to consider. And this work, just looking at heat treatment of colostrum or the pasteurization of colostrum, and this is your typical pasteurization protocol of 60 degrees for 60 minutes. And this is research that came out of the University of Alberta and Dr. Leilu Guan's group, where they looked at calves after feeding one meal of colostrum that was either fresh or heat treated, which is your typical pasteurization protocol. And they also had this really interesting group on the left that had no colostrum. And what you can see from this particular graph is that the proportion of bifidobacterium when you're not feeding colostrum at 6 hours and 12 hours after feeding this colostrum in the ileum in this particular graph is lower. So you want to establish a lot of bifidobacterium here, and it's just not happening when you're not feeding colostrum. With respect to the fresh colostrum, though, it is lower at 6 hours, but it then does increase at 12 hours compared to the heat treatment, where it's high at 6 hours and it still maintains to be high even at 12 hours. And what's another interesting finding that will show up shortly on this slide is that it's not just the bifidobacterium, but also the amount of E. coli in that particular gut was also decreased through the pasteurization of colostrum. So, albeit I think it's something that a tool that farmers can use. This was more of a proof of concept experiment, just showcasing the way that we treat the colostrum can have a long-term impact here with respect to the microbial colonization in the first day. So I think it's just food for thought at this point. But it's something, if you're concerned about the pathogen load going through colostrum, something to consider on your farm. Something that we were also interested in, we were trying to reduce the pathogen load, but this brought us to what is this pasteurization process actually doing to the carbohydrate fraction in colostrum? And as I mentioned before, there's not a lot of lactose within colostrum, but there's a lot of oligosaccharides, and they're really the food source for bifidobacteria. So they're actually a prebiotic for healthy bacteria within this calf's gut. There's also other different modes of actions where they can be binding particular pathogens as well, such as E. coli, so that they won't be colonizing this enterocyte. And there's also another mode of action where there's, in other species, where it's been shown that these oligosaccharides can actually improve the transit of immunoglobulins into the enterocyte. So I don't think we really know a lot about this. We'll see that when you pasteurize colostrum, you're actually freeing a lot of these free oligosaccharides from the protein and fat matrix within colostrum. And there's a relationship between the amount of available oligosaccharides being delivered to this calf and the amount of healthy bacteria, such as bifidobacteria, that's colonizing this calf's gut. So in this particular case, it looks like freeing this some of these oligosaccharides through the heat treatment could potentially be beneficial. And these are just looking at the main oligosaccharides that are found within colostrum. There's literally over 50 of them, but the 3' siallactose is the dominant one. And this is a huge dose of prebiotic that every calf receives within colostrum. So this led us to learning more and more about oligosaccharides, because we think that it's really key not only to classify what's going on in colostrum, but also this transition milk. And I'm defining transition milk, the second, third, fourth, and fifth milking in lactation. And if you look at this graph, you'll notice that there's a lot of differences between multiparous and primiparous cows here with respect to production of these oligosaccharides. And it's still quite high even in the second and third milking from a concentration standpoint. So I think that we need to characterize these more. And this leads to one of my first questions for the panel, is how that I'll let Mike handle.
Well, very good, Mike. We are have our first polling question. So Jim has got the poll open. How many meals of high quality colostrum should we feed? 1 meal, 2 meals, 4 meals, 8 meals. So we're got the polls open and we're off and running. And wow, we're voting pretty fast. Abby, do you want to vote here?
Yeah, I think obviously getting 1 meal of high quality colostrum in is important, but I know that there's been more and more talk about getting calves more colostrum if possible. 8 meals might be hard to do that, and even 4, but I think I'll vote for 2 meals. And so that's a good target for calves.
Yeah, my question is, is that colostrum going to do something in the lower gut 4 meals or 8 meals later? So we'll let Mike wrestle with that, and we're going to close the poll. So what do you think?
Okay. Great. Yeah, I think that this is exactly what I expected, and I would also recommend at least 2 meals of colostrum. And I'd be concerned with feeding more though, and I would be transitioning them from colostrum to a milk after those first 2 meals. And I'll discuss why in my future slides. One of the problems I have with colostrum feeding is that I think we're too fixated on immunoglobulins and passive transfer, and we're really not paying close attention to the other bioactives within colostrum, and as well as transition milk. We'll see that there's a lot more to colostrum rather than just immunoglobulins. For example, from a protein standpoint, and you look at lactoferrin, insulin growth hormone, insulin-like growth factors, even the second, third, fourth, and fifth milking, which isn't truly colostrum, but it is transition milk, they're still really high. So I think that we should be feeding 2 meals of colostrum, but then not just going straight to a milk or a milk replacer. I think that we should consider feeding a transition milk. So this started a series of studies that we've conducted based on this idea is that, if you're feeding this transition milk, it's been shown in practical experiments that it does improve health of these animals. So we did this experiment. We fed all calves 1 meal of colostrum followed by a quick transition to milk, or a transition to 50% milk, 50% colostrum, and returning that transition, or just colostrum. When we kept them on these meals for 6 meals up to 72 hours of life, and then we dissected them. And this is just looking at the jejunum of these calves with respect to villi development. And what you'll notice is that when you're feeding a lot more colostrum, or this transition, 50% milk, 50% colostrum, you're going to have a lot more villi development. And the surface area of these villi were actually the same between the 50% and the colostrum groups. But there was a big difference from a microscopic standpoint with respect to surface area in these calves that were transitioned from a colostrum straight to a whole milk in this particular experiment. It really depresses gastrointestinal development. So in the microscopic world, there was a difference in villi length of 150 micron between the milk and the other two treatments. So that's actually microscopically an enormous difference with respect to villi structure. And this really comes at a time when they need as many nutrients as possible. I don't think we're really feeding them enough at this time in the first week of life, but I also think we're not really establishing the proper machinery for them to absorb these nutrients as well, as you can see from this particular slide. In this experiment, the same experiment as the last slide, we fed every single calf the same meal in the first meal, and then we imposed our treatments at the 12-hour mark of life. And this is just looking at blood immunoglobulin levels. And this second meal was actually a lot smaller than this first meal, but as you can see with this second meal of colostrum, you're still going to get the boost of this immunoglobulin within the blood. So that's why I highly recommend feeding 2 meals of colostrum and then going through this transition. And I think it should be a gradual transition. What's even interesting, even the 50% milk, 50% colostrum group still increased in the amount of immunoglobulins within blood. So I think the gut is a lot more open than what we think. And this leads to some of the work that we've been trying to do in our lab, and we have some experiments based on some of these ideas that will be conducted this year. I really want to look at the mechanism of passive transfer more. And I know we've been talking about it a lot. We think it's a transcytosis of immunoglobulins. We think it's receptor mediated through FC receptors. But basically, if we have a pinocytosis followed by an endosome formation, then a release to the membrane, but some of them are actually released back into the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract, and some are actually metabolized as well. What's really surprising is that we really don't know what's regulating this. So we've talked about passive transfer, gut closure, but we actually don't know the mechanisms of how this actually works and what controls it. And I think if we understand what controls it, we can really manipulate it into a positive outcome in this calf. So we're going to be working on this area in the next 5 years, but we have an experiment planned this year to try to determine what's really regulating this. So I'd like to make a quick switch to normal pre-weaning milk intake and just comparing traditionally how we've been feeding calves during the pre-weaning period conventionally through milk consumed, feeding around 10% of birth body weight compared to an ad libitum feeding. And this is some work out of the University of British Columbia, one of the first studies really comparing the two. What I want to focus on is this first week. And what I am interested in this first week is because of the work also done in British Columbia, Canada. This is milk intake at day 4 of life. And even if we're feeding accelerated milk programs at 4 to 5 liters is typically where we're feeding them in the first week before we start ramping them up. But as you can see from this particular graph, they can consume a lot more than what we give them credit for. We have some calves actually consuming close to 12 liters at day 4 of life. So this got me thinking more and more, are we underfeeding calves in the first weeks of life? We always talk about the entire pre-weaning period, but when they're not eating significant amounts of starter in the first 3 weeks of life, I think this is the real opportunity to accelerate growth. This is a video taking at the University of Alberta. This is a calf rail system. And these are calves that are 4 days old, consuming out of this calf rail that's connected to an automated feeder. And technologies like this are great at accelerating number of meals per day. So we can actually deliver this calf rail full of milk to this calf every hour if we wanted to program it to be like that. But typically they're being fed 4 to 5 times a day with this system. And same with all automated feeders. So I think ramping up the meal frequency is a really good way of getting more milk into these calves early in life when they're incredibly efficient and not eating significant amounts of starter. We'll notice that, there's been a lot of backlash with respect to, feeding these large meals. It's great when you have a system like in this slide, it's from University of Alberta, some of the work that we did comparing a low meal, so 2 meals of 2.5 liters versus 4 meals of 2.5 liters, so a low versus a high. Really, you're going to get so much advantage in the first 3 weeks of life. There's 4 weeks of significance here. But I really wonder what we're missing out on and if we are really underestimating the capacity of this abomasum, which leads me to the next question in this webinar.
Okay, we're going to try this again. And the question is for our listeners, how large should a meal of milk be if a calf is fed or being fed twice a day? 1 liter, which basically is 1 quart, 2 liters, 4 liters, or 8 liters of milk in each of the meals if you're feeding 2x or twice a day. So the polls are open and we're off and running here, and we will see where we come out. Abby, do you want to discuss how many quarts or liters you want to feed in each of the meals?
I'm going to go with the 4 liter mark. I mean, like Mike had said, there's a lot of variation on what people think is the right amount and number of times per day. So I guess that would be my guess for twice a day feeding. I'll say 4 liters. What do you say, Mike?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you as well. I'm going to go with 4 liters here, but I'm a little nervous from what Michael said earlier. So we're going to go ahead and close the poll and see what we have here. And Mike, you may want to comment on you agree or disagree. So
yeah, I agree. I have no problem going up to 4 liters per meal during the pre-weaning period. And I'd like to show you some of the results in my presentation that really support this idea that you can, even in the first weeks of life, feed larger meals. And I know why we're not feeding larger meals is when you follow what a calf does in nature, they feed many times a day, 6 to 12. But these larger meals, and there's a history of research here showing there's lots of inflammation lesions, overflow into the rumen, acidosis, decreased passage rate, and digestion. But this is all coming from milk-fed veal studies where you're consuming meals between 8 and 10 liters 2 times a day. So we're not comparing apples to apples. So we did an experiment based on this idea that we could be, underestimating how much this abomasum can hold. So this was an experiment done in Norway that really inspired us to do this work. And there's young calves fed 2 liters of milk per meal 3 times a day, offered ad lib meal full of barium sulfate. So you can actually visualize. It can show you that as soon as this calf are offered this meal, as much as they can consume, they were all drinking over 5 liters. There's one calf that actually fed 8 liters during this time. So I think that there's lots of potential here to actually feed more meals. There was also another report showing that if you feed these high meals, you're going to be reducing insulin sensitivity in the first weeks of life. So what we didn't like about this experiment was the replication, but also, these calves were fed these 4 versus 2 liter meals 2 times a day, starting at 2 weeks of life. And we really wanted to start this in the first week of life. And to our surprise, when we compared the 8 versus the 4 liter, so the 4 liter meal versus the 2 liter meal, there was no difference in insulin sensitivity with respect to glucose tolerance, as well as postprandial insulin and glucose levels. And we thought, how does the calf do this? This is amazing. So again, we put acetaminophen within the meal, and we looked at passage rate from this abomasum to the intestine. What we noticed is that these smaller meals actually flow quickly to this to the intestine from the abomasum. But this larger meal, this calf has the ability to slow down the release of milk from the abomasum to the small intestine to control blood glucose and insulin. This slide shows a postprandial data set with acetaminophen, glucose, and insulin of a calf at day 21 of life fed a 4-liter meal. And you'd expect this perfect curve, but that doesn't happen. You have a peak in blood glucose and a peak in blood insulin, and then it goes down. And then it goes back up again around 200 minutes. So what's really controlling this is the acetaminophen, which is outlined here in green. So the acetaminophen is just your marker of gastric emptying, is increasing in the first 60 minutes, and then you've got the peak in blood glucose and insulin around 80 minutes, and then it slows down, as you can see from the slope of this green. As soon as blood glucose and insulin levels go down, around the 180-minute mark, and then you have an increase in gastric emptying again. So what's interesting about this is that blood glucose and insulin in a calf are actually controlled by abomasal emptying rate. So this calf that's receiving these large meals has an ability to decrease the passage rate so the system isn't overloaded with blood glucose. What's really controlling all this are endocrine cells within the distal region of the small intestine of the calf. So, nutrients or bioactive molecules that are in the lumen can signal to these endocrine L cells to release these gut hormones. The ones that we study in our lab are glucagon-like peptides. So GLP-1, which is a major drug used in diabetes research for humans, but also GLP-2. And some of them can act systemically and they can also act locally. So GLP-1 can actually affect gastric emptying. So gastric motility. GLP-2 has been shown to decrease gut permeability. Both of them can increase proliferation and also blood flow and overall nutrient absorption. So I think any way that we can find to stimulate the release of these really healthy hormones naturally is really positive for the calf. So that's something that our lab has been studying a lot in the last 5 years. Just going through, like typically in the history and growing up on a dairy farm in Ontario, we were only really using 2-liter bottles. And I think that this advancement, although very simple, just moving it to just a 3-liter or a 4-liter bottle is really a step in the right direction and not really underestimating how much this calf can consume per meal. So although very, very simple innovation here, I think it's had a huge impact in our industry. And that becomes really critical when you see what's going on in certain areas of the US right now, especially Canada, where I'm from, the amount of cold stress that a calf it has to go through. So I think feeding these larger meals is totally fine and actually preferred and actually essential during the winter time. We have to be feeding either one more meal of milk or increasing our meal size. And this is just looking at the nutrient requirements of a calf, different body weights, but just looking at different temperatures. And, you look at the feeding rates of a 55 kilo calf at 20 degrees, you have to double the amount of milk replacer or milk that you're feeding these calves if you're going to have a cold stress of -30. And I think we need to pay really close attention to this. And it's very evident here in Canada and also in the northern parts of the US. I think that cold stress is really affecting our growth rates on many farms. So this leads to another question that we received about what are the milk quality differences in protein and fat sources that come from skim milk and whey? And do they have different effects on gut health and overall digestibility? And this is a really timely question because we just started 2 PhDs in our lab really looking at milk replacer composition and also the ingredients that go into it. So with respect to proteins coming from skim milk and whey protein, the actual composition with respect to amino acids is not that different, but the fats really aren't coming from these 2 particular ingredients. Carbohydrates with respect to where whey permeate will be coming from. So I think it's important to look at what ingredients are going in, but I think it's even more important to look at the actual composition of the milk replacer. Because I do think the composition of the milk replacer can have a lot of impact on gut health, also insulin sensitivity, and overall digestibility as well. So I think it's important, and typically you're trying to feed a little bit more skim within your milk replacers just so you can promote clotting within the abomasum. But I think what's even more important is to not really look at this question in the sense of what ingredients are going in, but the actual chemical composition of all the ingredients going in. Because when you go to compare milk replacer and whole milk, there's big differences. And these are just looking at your standard milk replacers that are on the market on the bottom compared to a whole milk on the top. So lactose is always a lot higher in milk replacers. There's hardly, I've yet to find many milk replacers on the market that are very similar in lactose levels compared to a milk. Also, the fats are very low in milk replacers. So 18% versus your standard 31%. Protein is relatively consistent. Ash is a lot higher in milk replacers. That's a topic for another day, though. And I just think that where I want to focus on with this presentation is the big differences in just the composition of lactose and fat. This is some preliminary work that we've been doing in this area, and we just wanted to look at the osmoles and how the osmoles could be affecting gut barrier function. So through work done by my PhD student before coming to my lab, Juliette Wilms, she's shown that if you increase the milk replacer in osmoles to create a hypertonic milk replacer, you're going to be increasing gut permeability. The problem we have here is that there's not many milk replacers on the market that are around the similar osmoles as a milk. Usually they're above 400. And in infant work or in infant industry, we're not allowed to sell infant formulas over 350, but almost all milk replacers on the market are like this. So I think this is something to keep our eye on. And the osmoles are coming from the lactose as well as the ash predominantly. So something to keep your eye on is the lactose out of balance. We probably should be paying closer attention to that in the total osmoles of the milk replacer. Also, some recent work is just showing that the actual milk replacer composition being higher in lactose could be decreasing insulin sensitivity in the first weeks of life when you're feeding these large meals. This is all very preliminary data, though, and I prefer to do a lot more research before making blanket statements on this. But the point I want to make is that we need to pay closer attention to the composition of milk replacers and really challenge it and really understand what it's doing to programming this calf in early life. So my take-home messages for this entire presentation is that there's some basic concepts of calf biology and nutrition that we don't understand. That's what makes it very exciting to be a calf nutritionist at this point. And there's no difference between tube versus bottle feeding colostrum for passive transfer. Also the release of gut peptides. Delaying colostrum by 6 hours can impact passive transfer and also gut microbiology too. And also pasteurizing colostrum may help to improve calf gut health, but I want to stress only if it's managed properly. Then going to this abruptness of this transition, I think that we do have these abrupt transitions from colostrum to milk. I know we always talk about the transition of weaning and transition dairy cows, but I think that this abruptness is compromising gut development from colostrum to milk, and we should make it a lot more smoother in the first week of life. Calves that consume large quantities of milk in early life when starter intake is depressed, I think is if you're going to be feeding more milk or wanting to feed milk, feed it to them when they're not eating starter is, I think, the best approach. So in that first week of life and not waiting until 4 weeks to maximize overall intake. If feeding times per day is limited, the calf can regulate by decreasing abomasal emptying as well. So feeding up to 4 liters a meal, I think, is totally acceptable. And the environmental temperature has a large impact on milk feeding regimens. So during the winter, if it's not a controlled environment, we need to be feeding a lot more milk. So either increasing the meal size or increasing the frequency of feeding. Some milk replacers are too high in lactose, which may compromise calf health. We don't really know at this point. We're just getting into this area. But I think we need to keep our eye on just not only protein and fat in milk replacer, but also lactose is the point I want to make for today. We'll know a lot more about this in the future. And I think really the key is if you've got your milk replacers or your whole milk, they'll both work fine as long as it's consistent. And if you have any inconsistencies, it can throw off gut health. So I'd like to also thank everyone for providing this opportunity to speak at the HORTS webinar. Also my industry collaborators who sponsor this research. as well as my academic collaborators as well from around the world. I really appreciate their support. And most importantly, I really want to thank my lab, who's been through a great transition from the University of Alberta this year to the University of Guelph. And they work so hard, and they don't take themselves too seriously, as you can see from these images. It's been an honor and a pleasure to work with them, and they inspire me every day. With that, I'd like to just thank everyone again for joining this webinar. I look forward to the questions, and if you're ever in Ontario, Canada, and you'd like to tour our research station or visit our lab, I'd be very happy to host you. So I look forward to the questions. Thank you very much for this time to speak.
Very good. Thank you, Michael, for a great presentation. You've shared a lot of information with the research that you've been doing in the area of calfhood nutrition. This is so important for all of us in getting calves off to a healthy start in life. The more we can learn about feeding calves, the better all of our dairy herds will be. So thank you for sharing the work that you've done in this area. Very much appreciated. I'd also like to thank Cargill for their sponsorship of this webinar. We really appreciate their support. Partners like that help us make these webinars possible for all of you who are attending today. If you enjoyed today's webinar, I would encourage you to meet us again at one of our future webinars. Again, we have our monthly webinars the second Monday of each month. They're always at noon Central Time. On March 9th, we'll be visiting with Scott Prawley and Pam Sells-Prawley, who are Wisconsin dairy farmers. And they have a 30,000 plus herd average, and they also are the herd that can call the record-breaking cow who has the highest milk production in the world as part of their herd. So we're going to visit with them and learn all about their dairy operation and the different aspects that help them maintain high production and make use of the genetics that they have built in their herd. Then in April, we have a presentation by our very own Mike Hutchins, and the presentation that month will be a closer look at B vitamins in the ration. So focusing on some nutrition topics in April. So we'll look forward to hearing from Mike then. If anyone wants to view this webinar again or share it with someone else, or look back at any of our past webinars that we have done, we would invite you to check out our website, www.hordes.com, and find the webinar tab. And there you can find all of our webinars. We had some questions come in while Michael was speaking. So Mike, if you'll go ahead and go through those. It looks like our list keeps growing, so we better get started on it.
Very good, Mike. This is kind of the speed round, so hang on your hats and away we go. Lots of really good questions here, actually. First one, is there any concern of disease transfer from commercially available dry colostrum replacers or supplements if I'm buying them for my farm use?
No, I don't think that there is a large risk. I think there'd be probably more risk with what's happening on your farm. So I would say that these are tested, they're registered by the government, they're tested routinely. I think that the probability is very low.
Another question, are there some pros and cons with feeding egg IgY? Now, that might be IgG, but we'll let you make that decision. Antibodies to calves, and how do you see that developing or not developing in the future?
Yeah, so looking at alternatives to different immunoglobulins, yeah, there are some IgY products out on the market. I haven't seen a lot of peer-reviewed data on it. I have heard a lot of anecdotal evidence that it can work quite well. But I think that without the peer reviews, maybe there are some peer-reviewed papers in calves out there. That'd be great if I could learn more about that, but I can't really comment in great detail. I think that there's probably some potential there. I like the concept, but I don't think we've got the peer-reviewed data to really support it at this point.
Michael, I'm just smiling here because on our dairy farm many years ago, when a calf was having some scours, we always had chickens on the farm. We had to crack 2 eggs down the down the calf's throat. Yep. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just for our listener. Yeah.
There's a lot of products on the market where they're immunizing chickens and for different pathogens that are common in the calf industry, and then feeding the egg immunoglobulins from those. So I think this concept's there. I just like to see a lot more publication in that particular area.
Okay, here's another one. It says, what was the colostrum feeding protocol from the data from Pyro 2020 research? Do you understand the question?
Yep. So that was actually pasteurized colostrum that we were feeding. So in a lot of those experiments, we're pooling all the colostrum. So we test hundreds of batches of colostrum and with a collaborator of ours, the Saskatoon Colostrum Company. And they're, so if we want to say we want a 65 gram per liter IgG colostrum with this composition, we can actually formulate it. So we mix them all, pasteurize it, and that's where they were fed. That's what they were fed. So every calf received the same colostrum. And we do that in all of our experiments. We just find it very difficult to study things, study colostrum management when different colostrum is being fed all the time to each calf. And then after that, the transitions were, we quickly transitioned them to a 50% colostrum, 50% milk. And that was a pasteurized whole milk from our farm that again was frozen in one batch to keep it consistent throughout the entire experiment. But I think it really shows us that you should have a gradual decline from colostrum to milk. And I think we need to work out that protocol, what's optimal from a cost standpoint, as well as from a physiological standpoint, what is best. But usually, if we just mimic what mother does, I think the calves will be healthier.
I think you've answered that right just now, and that is if I fed colostrum smaller farms where I can follow the colostrum from the calf, from the dam, would that naturally occur, that 50-50 ratio, if I fed her second milking, her fourth milking, her sixth milking coming from her dam?
So it's a little bit exaggerated with a 50% mix if you're feeding it for 2 to 3 days. So I think the second meal would definitely be very similar to a 50% mix, probably be a little bit more concentrated on the colostrum side. But then by the second or third day, it would be a lot lower than a 50% mix. I don't think we know enough about extending colostrum feeding programs at this point. There's been some data showing that if we feed just a little bit of colostrum within our milk replacer for the first weeks of life, we can have this health response. But that's, again, very small concentrations of immunoglobulins being delivered to calves, around 15 grams, and all the other bioactives within colostrum. I think it has to be a gradual decrease. I'm not sure of the steps that we take to optimize it from a cost and physiological standpoint, but I think if we follow what happens with the cow and what she does, I think that's a really good sign of where we should be heading. But I think that this idea of going from a colostrum to a milk replacer or a whole milk in a day is not optimal for a calf.
Okay, you mentioned that the larger meal sizes with the larger bottles. Would there be a difference between bigger bottles versus bucket, or the bucket feeding versus the bottle feeding at these higher levels?
Yeah, so these high levels are fed in the veal industry, in the milk-fed veal industry here in Canada all the time, and we're talking meal sizes of 8 to 10 liters. And about 1% of calves are what we call ruminal drinkers. So for some reason, they're all being bucket fed, no nipples at all in feeding programs with veal calves. And about 1% of them are termed ruminal drinkers. It just goes straight to the rumen. And you can pick them out even visually. So I think that the point I want to make here is that I think some calves are just more susceptible to not having this esophageal groove working really well when feeding out of a bucket compared to a bottle. And I don't think that this should stop us from feeding more milk, even if we don't have nipples available or bottles available. I still think that, and I know many herds that are feeding elevated levels of milk in the first weeks of life that are still feeding out of a bucket or a bowl. So I still think it should work.
Curiosity, you said you can see these rumen drinkers. So what are you looking at the side of the calf? You say you can see them. What are you looking at?
Just the overall health of the animal, but also the size of the animal. They're just not going to be growing, and they'll have diarrhea in a lot of cases in it. So typically, if there's poor doers, if you do some more investigation, they're typically ruminal drinkers in a veal farm. But the point I wanted to make there is that there's still just a small percentage of calves that are like that. And that shouldn't stop us from feeding more milk if we don't have a nipple or a bottle to use.
Very good. Here's a good question. With milk replacer, do you think 200 grams per liter, and if my math is right, that's 20% for us non-metric people, for a total of 2 liters per meal. Is that too concentrated for the calf, considering, and also considered when it's fed in an open bucket? So several questions there. 20% versus 13%, and then at the 2 liters per meal level.
Yeah, I would have a lot of concerns with feeding it at that concentration. I would try to get close to 150 grams per liter. And then if you want to feed more milk or a milk replacer, I'd be increasing the meal size. My concern there is you're going to make the solution hypertonic, and I think that's going to disturb the gastrointestinal health of a calf. So I wouldn't be feeding it at that concentration. I think that you could also be dehydrating the calf if it's not able to regulate through water intake with that large concentration that you would have. So I think the closer to 150 grams per liter, the better. There's some deviation. I'd feel comfortable going up to 165 or 135 grams per liter, but closer to 150 I think is better.
Okay, here's a comment coming from Pakistan, and it was someone who was an effective farm manager feeding 16 to 18 liters of milk, offered in 2 different feedings, therefore 8 to 9 liters per meal, and one day after after the calf was born, and had no side effects. And his opinion, or her opinion, was that the calf will consume what she needs or wants. What do you think about that?
I think that should be the approach, and I think that I grew up on a dairy farm, and of course, my dad, when I decided to go into research, sold the quota and sold the cows here in Canada, and then within a year there was beef calves. Basically, our barn was completely full of beef calves, and what I got to do is just watch calves naturally and what they do, and I think that there's a lot of truth to just giving them what they actually need. Or what they would actually receive in nature. And I think that concept comes from colostrum. It comes from milk feeding in the first week or even the first day of life, and also weaning. I think that there's many things that we can learn from just observing nature's mother and trying to mimic that on a farm as much as we can. Granted, we're not going to be feeding milk to 6 to 8 months. It doesn't make any economic sense to do that. But we can just be aware of that and try our best to make sure that weaning protocols or milk feeding and colostrum protocols are really sound and mimic as closely as we can to Mother Nature.
Well, get your thinking caps on. Would you change the maximum meal size for Jersey calves or crossbred calves that are smaller?
Yeah, I receive this question all the time. I don't have the data to really support it, but I've heard anecdotally that Jerseys can consume more as a percentage of body weight than Holstein. So I just proposed in the Jersey experiment that we'd like to do this year. But at this point, I don't really know. I just know that they can probably handle a little bit more as a percentage of body weight compared to a Holstein. So I would, again, look at, use your metric of growth rates to really assess an overall health. But I think that they could actually consume large meal sizes as well as a Holstein.
Okay, for smaller farms who really can't justify the expense of a colostrum pasteurizer, is raw colostrum or colostrum replacement your recommendation?
If they can't afford the pasteurization, yeah. But then if you're not pasteurizing it, I would test all of your feeding instruments on a frequent basis to make sure that there's not bacterial overgrowth. Just because you can't see the bacteria doesn't mean it's not there. So I think, getting your veterinarian or your nutritionist to help you out with that. There's many different gadgets that you could quickly assess on a farm to understand the total bacterial load. You could also start culturing to make sure that everything's clean too. So I think if you're really on top of things, your calving pen's really clean, your instruments for feeding are incredibly clean and tested, I would feel a lot more confident. But I don't think that that's really happening on most farms, to be very frank with everyone. So that's why I think pasteurization could help under circumstances with managers that can assure me that there's not going to be a pathogen load delivered with that colostrum.
If I'm feeding a milk replacer with high levels of protein, can that change the ability of the gut to absorb, I assume, the proteins and other nutrients? Does it have an impact on the gut?
Yeah, I don't think that we really, when you compare the milk replacer formulations, we're still the highest one I've seen on the market is 28%, which is pretty much where whole milk is. So I don't think that we're really capping out. As long as it's a high quality protein source, we're not really maxed out with respect to digestibility of that protein. So I don't have a concern there.
About how many solids can be, can I assume that pounds or kilograms can be fed in one meal? And then the question was percent solids. I think you've answered that one already, but is there a limit of how many actual grams can be fed?
So if you use the 4-liter one, so that was all milk replacer in that study fed at 150 grams per liter. So for meal size, it would be 0.6 kilos. So be 1.2 kilos per day. I would feel very comfortable feeding that at 150 grams per liter.
Another question is, if we are feeding 8 liters of milk twice a day in the first week.
Yep.
Oh, move it up, Jim. There it is. I got it now. How many IgGs should be fed? I'm not sure if that's the same question or not. It's unusual. Two different questions, Jim said. Let's go to the simple one. How many grams of IgG should be fed in the initial feeding?
I think it's that increasing it from 100 grams typically traditionally is what we've been talking about, but just getting a lot more insurance and going up to 150 grams of immunoglobulins within the first meal is a good idea. There's some research groups that say all the way to 200. I don't think we really know enough about that, but I'd like to make one comment. And I was just talking about it with my graduate students this morning, is that we're so fixated on apparent efficiency of absorption, and that just really tells us that these immunoglobulins are going into the bloodstream. But what about the bioactivities of immunoglobulins within the gut? Just because it doesn't pass through the gut and show up in the blood, is this really, are we really truly wasting the immunoglobulins? Is it affecting the gut microbiome in any way, or the actual host gut in some positive or negative way? I don't think we really know. So although, that's the best we can do right now to assess colostrum quality on a farm, is to look at immunoglobulin levels in blood. Maybe there is a benefit to making sure that we're putting a lot more in, and maybe even feeding it after 24 hours. There could be some advantages that are not just related to apparent efficiency of absorption. So I know that was a long-winded answer. The answer is 150 grams is typically standard, but I think we need to open up our mind to maybe it's not just immunoglobulins going into blood. Maybe there's an advantage that we're not picking up with increasing our apparent efficiency absorption, but actually feeding more colostrum and reducing our apparent efficiency of absorption. And when you consider multiple meals of colostrum, maybe that actually has a benefit sometimes. So I think that short answer 150, but there's probably some added advantages to feeding immunoglobulins that don't pass into the bloodstream.
Okay, what about feeding 8 liters, which I guess would be 2 gallons twice a day in the first week? Would you recommend that, or if the calf would consume it?
Yeah, so a calf will definitely consume. In this experiment, we were feeding 4 liters per meal. I'm assuming they're talking 8 liters per day. I think that can definitely be fed in the first week of life. I've noticed, like in veal operations or dairy beef operations, when they have to go through transportation and then mixing different farms, that can be a challenge. But if it's a replacement calf, that can be achieved. And I think that just because the calf doesn't drink the meal within a couple minutes, it's not a negative thing. For example, my son can consume his meal in 5 minutes. My daughter consumes it in 1 hour. I think there's a lot of variation in calves with respect to meal intake. And when you're feeding these larger meals, sometimes it just takes them a lot longer to consume that meal. And it doesn't mean that they're getting sick in the first week of life. I think we should just be more patient with them.
Okay, another question is, what's the value for a refractometer? What's your magic number you're looking for using the refractometer? I assume for colostrum is what he or she is referring to.
22 on a Brix is where I would strive for. for a
And
measurement.
how high can that number get?
I've seen some reach the high 20s. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any comment about once a day feeding of milk to calves?
I think, yeah, so that's not a very common practice. I know some states in the US and obviously New Zealand, they're moving more into that direction. I think with something like that, you really have to pay very close attention to the milk replacer composition because it could be affecting gut health. My preference is to feed more meals per day and to go into the 2 time a day feeding. But really the reason there is because of efficiency of nutrient conversion. I think that you'd receive a boost there as you get a boost even increasing the feeding frequency, the 2 time a day versus 3. But my preference is always feeding more than just one meal from a feed efficiency standpoint, also a gut health standpoint.
An interesting question, two-parter. If I could freeze dry colostrum on the farm, would there be a benefit of adding the colostrum to the milk replacer fed the first 10 to 14 days, or probably even just using colostrum if I did freeze dry it in the first 10 to 14 days?
Yes, and I know a lot of farms that are doing this based on some published work and some work that has been presented last year at ADSA. Yeah, and I know of other farms that are not just even freeze drying, but either feeding a dry colostrum source from a company and mixing it with the milk for the first weeks of life. In addition, other farmers that are freezing colostrum into ice cubes and just adding ice cubes to the milk in the first week of life. I think that there's great value in that. And you look at additives that are being fed in milk replacers and also to calves during weaning. I really think that colostrum is just a package of a whole wide variety of bioactives and essentially additives that can improve gastrointestinal and overall health of a calf. So I think there's a lot of merit to that. And I think we need to spend more time investigating those protocols.
Another question goes back to your oligosaccharides, and the listeners asking about different sources. Some of the maltodextrins, dextrins, versus depending on lactose. Any comments on those? If we should be adding those or different sources of those oligosaccharides?
Yeah, all we've been studying is the colostrum and milk oligosaccharides, and that's really the 3' style lactose, which is the dominant one. When you look at the other oligosaccharides that are really well researched, like the FOS, GOS, MOS, that are showing up in many milk replacers as well as starters, I haven't studied those, but I think that there's a lot of merit to actually testing oligosaccharides within colostrum because I suspect that they're there for a big reason. And that reason, number one, would be to improve the health of the calf, in particular the gut health of the calf, by providing this massive dose of prebiotics. So although I haven't studied the ones that I've mentioned in that question, I would say if you could find a source of oligosaccharides that either through supplementing colostrum or finding another stream in milk processing, I think there would be an advantage to feeding the more natural to the calf oligosaccharides that are coming from colostrum and milk.
Believe it or not, we're getting to the end here, Mike, so hang on. Is pasteurization reducing IgG levels in colostrum?
Yeah, so there's some studies that have shown that if you have a deviation in the temperature, it will. So if you increase your temperatures for pasteurization, it could. But at 60 degrees for 60 minutes, and forgive my math, I believe that's 140 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 minutes, it should not really affect the concentrations of immunoglobulins within colostrum. However, if you have a pasteurizer that's malfunctioning or you're heating it on too much, I think it can actually. But for your standard pasteurization protocol, it shouldn't, by theory.
Interesting. We know that milk can contain higher levels of progesterone, which could have some impact on the calf itself. Does that make milk replacers safer than whole milk? Any thoughts on that?
I don't think it would really no, I don't think it would actually. I'm not really familiar with what progesterone would be doing to this calf, but I don't think it would be a concern.
Okay, what about dehydration, probably in summer, in terms of the total serum protein levels if you're doing the blood analysis? Is weather going to be a factor there, summer or winter?
I don't. I'd like to just say that this is a very crude measurement. It's the best we have, but it's the most crude. And I think that the health status of the animal and the hydration can affect these results. That's very clear. So I do agree that maybe there's some seasonality differences, but right now we don't have an alternative. Now, I think there's many gadgets that will be coming out on the market that will be a lot more specific, and these gadgets are actually coming out in the market even now, where you can assess blood immunoglobulin levels in a calf side. So I think that's a lot more specific. So as I do agree with the total proteins, there can be some variability in that total protein that's coming from something else outside of the passive transfer of immunoglobulins from colostrum. It's just, what is our alternative right now? I still think it's a great thing to do. I recommend doing it on farm, but I think what you'll be seeing will be a lot more specific on farm with our tests with respect to colostrum management in the future.
A fairly specific question here. Is there any evidence of better milk production in adult life if you give them more milk since the first week of life? Now, I think I read that question and you've answered that already, I think.
So there's lots of debate there in the literature. Definitely growth. And then the debate there is, does it really come from milk, or is it just these calves can consume more starter? I think if they consume more calories in the first months of life, there's a greater probability of more milk being produced later on in life. Where these calories come from, I don't think we're truly defined where it is with a lot of these association studies. However, in the first 3 weeks of life, they're not consuming starter, okay? Even if you have a calf that's really aggressive with starter consumption, the metabolizable energy intake from starter in those first 3 weeks of life is really not that significant. So I don't understand how we could really be accelerating growth in the first 3 weeks of life if it's not coming from more milk. That's my biggest question when I look at a lot of these studies. But it is clear that it's debatable whether it's coming from milk or actually starter in certain studies. But I can't get my head around calves not consuming starter in the first weeks of life and not allowing them to, drink milk at higher levels to accelerate growth. But I'm very open to debate, and I've learned a lot through both streams of the researchers that have supported high levels of milk feeding and ones that are more encouraging starter intake.
And that segues right into this question, and that is, if a calf is consuming 2 kilos or 4 pounds of calf starter, can I wean her, or what's your philosophy on weaning calves in terms of starter intake and how gradual?
Yeah, so it's great that you're measuring starter intake, and I think 4 pounds is a suitable level for weaning a calf. And if you're going to be feeding more milk, you're going to have a lot more weaning stress. And I think first things first is to wean them later in life. So definitely, if you're feeding more milk, you have to wean later, or else you're going to have a lot more weaning stress, and that growth advantage will go away because of the weaning stress. So wean after 8 weeks of life, and I would definitely have more than a 2-week step down for these weaning protocols too. Then I would start looking at the different composition of the starters, because I think that we've been designing starters more so for feeding less milk. And that's why when we use these starters that are typically really high in starch, when we feed less milk, they're okay. But if we feed more milk, there's going to be a lot more stress. And I think that starch is a big issue with them. And this is purely just at the hypothesis level at this point. We've done some experiments in it last year, but a lot more work that needs to be done here.
Here's our last question, and that is, if I do not have high quality colostrum as measuring by IgGs, can I just feed more liters to achieve the same levels of IgG you mentioned a bit earlier?
That question really depends on the actual concentration of the IgG, but I would definitely try to make sure that you're delivering that 150 grams of immunoglobulins. And I think a meal size of 3 liters approximately would be a good meal to start with. In the first, I'd be a little bit concerned with dosing this animal with large volume in the first hour of life, let's say over 4 liters. I'd be more concerned with, especially if you're tubing. If the calf wants to consume it, then let it consume it. But I think that I would be saving the poor quality colostrum for maybe the second meal of life and feeding the best and most concentrated in that first meal. But that question really relies on the concentration of thresholds that you would have.
Well, Michael, you've given almost a second webinar here. You've done a yeoman's job with the questions. There's 3 more, but we've answered them. You've touched on those answers already. So those people can just go back and listen to the archives if they want to catch it. Abby, we'll turn it back to you to wrap up the program.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, I think our attendees gave you a mental workout this time, Michael. That was a tremendous amount of questions, and you answered them wonderfully. So thank you for that additional information that you shared. Once again, I want to thank Cargill for their support of our webinar. It's very much appreciated. And thank you, Michael, for your presentation and taking time to be with us this month. We really enjoyed having you as part of our webinar series.
Yeah, it was an honor, and I really appreciate it. I'm really impressed by the quality of preparation that goes into your webinars, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you. Again, we're very pleased to have you on board, so thanks. If anyone's interested in our future webinars, we have the next 2 listed here on the screen. In March, on the 9th, we will have a presentation by some Wisconsin dairy producers, Scott Prawley and Pam Sells-Prawley, talking about their high milk producing herd. Then in April, on the 13th, we will have a presentation by Dr. Hutchins, and he will be talking about B vitamins in dairy cattle rations. So please make plans to attend those future webinars. And then once again, we'd like to thank all of you who are out in the audience for joining us today. We know your schedules are busy, so we really appreciate when you take the time to join us on one of our webinars or listen in on the archives at a later time. So thanks very much for being a part of our webinar series. Until next time, I'd like to say thank you to all our listeners and to our presenter once again. And we look forward to hearing you on a future Hordes Dairyman and University of Illinois webinar. So take care, everyone.